My name is Katie Gray, and I am the Community Education Director at the Blue Bench. Thank you all for joining us for our webinar, Beyond Punishment, Rethinking Responses to Sexual Violence Through Restorative Justice. If you just came in, please feel free to introduce yourself and what interested you in today's webinar. For those of you who require interpretation, Hema Chacon, community educator at the Blue Bench, will be providing Spanish interpretation today. So to join her interpretation, please see the bottom banner of your Zoom meeting, click more, and find the interpretation feature next to the little globe icon. And then you'll be able to hear Hema and have the option to mute the English audio. We also are going to drop a resource guide into the chat that has some of the key points from today's conversation that you can use to share with others or to remember some of the things that you've learned today. We also will email this to all participants after as well. So I'm going to get started just by telling everyone a little bit about the Blue Bench before we dive into the content. The Blue Bench has been operating since 1983. We're a community of survivors, allies, and advocates working to prevent sexual violence and build a safe and supportive Metro Denver. We work collaboratively to provide accessible, survivor-centered support services and empowering education. And the Blue Bench is Denver metro area's only comprehensive assault prevention and care center. We provide services for 9 Colorado counties. We have an immediate response of a 24-hour sexual assault hotline that's available in English and Spanish. We also offer hospital advocacy for anyone who has experienced an assault and wishes to go to the hospital. They can request an advocate to join them and support them in whatever ways they may need. They can request this hospital advocacy through our hotline or through the hospital directly. And we also offer resource navigation in English and Spanish so folks can call our resource line and hear back from us to get information and resources about whatever they might need when they're navigating an assault or supporting a loved one. We also offer a continuum of care for those who are 13 and up at low to no cost, which includes individual therapy in Spanish and English, group therapy, as well as a secondary survivors workshop called Someone I Love and various other specialized therapy groups. We also offer case management in Spanish and English, which is long-term support and accompaniment for folks as they're navigating the various systems that they may encounter after assaults. And then community education, which is developmentally appropriate workshops for various community groups, and prevention education here at the Blue Bench aims to stop sexual violence before it starts. This means addressing contributing factors at every level: individual, relational, community, and societal. Our community education programs empower people to recognize sexually inappropriate behavior, intervene in harmful situations, support survivors, and challenge harmful norms. We offer workshops for students in middle school through college and for our various adult groups. We have Uniting in Action, which is for high school students. Let's Talk About It for middle school students, Safe Bars, which is for alcohol serving establishments and hospitality industry professionals. Youth Empowerment and Safety is a program for parents, and we also have a version for youth serving professionals. Knowledge is Power, which is an overview of the problem of sexual violence for general community members, and then SHIELD, which is our anti-sexual harassment training for local businesses and corporations. If you're interested in booking one of these programs in your community, please go ahead and scan this QR code. You can also visit our website if you're interested, or email us at communityed@thebluebench.org if you are interested in learning more about our services. So today, we're here to discuss what restorative justice is and how to incorporate restorative justice practices when it comes to sexual violence. Again, for today's webinar, we have dropped that resource guide into the chat, and we're going to also send you a copy following the program. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can submit them into the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we will answer as many of those questions as we can at the end of our presentation. Please let us know if you're having any technical issues as well in the chat. And finally, I want to remind everyone to take care of themselves through this webinar as we will be discussing topics related to sexual violence. So if you need to step away or take a minute to engage in self-care, please do so. We also have our hotline number. It is on the bottom of almost every slide. If you want to call that, you're able to use that as a resource if you need support. So now please welcome our esteemed speakers, Maddie Dimmick and Haley Webb. I'm going to pass it over to Maddie to introduce herself. Maddie, take it away.
Hi, my name is Maddie Dimmick. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the lead case manager here at the Blue Bench. As part of the advocacy team, I've worked at the Blue Bench for close to 3 years, helping to support clients at any stage after they've been assaulted with getting the care and services that they need. I also provide support to the rest of the advocacy team. Recognizing that the criminal justice system does not serve my clients, I've invested heavily in learning about alternative forms of justice and accountability and have completed over 100 hours of training in facilitation as a restorative justice practitioner. As a practitioner, it's important to recognize the lineage of knowledge that was passed down to me. My training in restorative practices and circle process comes from Liz Porter Merrill and Lynn Lee, who were taught by Kay Pranis of the Tlingit and Tagish people in the Yukon Territory of what is now Canada, and Grandmother Strongoak of the Abenaki people.
Hi, I'm Haley Webb. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a master's in social work intern at the Blue Bench. I work on the resource and clinical team. I've been working at the Blue Bench for about the last 5-ish months since August. And I work on the resource line, connecting people with Denver-based resources, and I support the clinical team with intakes. My formal training in restorative justice started with Restorative Justice Colorado in 2020, and since then I have been actively engaged in restorative justice practices within public school settings, through Boys and Girls Club, and most recently on the Auraria College campus. I have received additional ongoing restorative justice training from Reverend Jinzu Minna Jan through Real Trainings and the Clouds and Water Zen Center, who was taught by NAM Provost, Resma Menachem, Angel Kyoto Williams, and the late, much loved Larry Wood. The goal of today's training is to share information on the differences between the criminal justice system and restorative justice, and shine a light on how restorative justice practices can be used to offer a survivor-focused repair pathway in high-impact harm, such as sexual assault or sexual violence. My passion for restorative justice started when working at Boys and Girls Club and seeing the direct impact that punitive behavior management systems have, and how incorporating restorative justice into clubs as a program manager immediately supported safer and more inclusive learning environments for our kids. I'm particularly interested in the way that empathy and shame can be held by restorative justice environments for the healing of those impacted, as well as the perpetrators of harm and violence. I've seen, again, firsthand, the ways that restorative justice systems can offer that healing and allow us to move forward with carceral abolition by replacing it with a non-punitive, community-centered repair work.
As someone who cares deeply that this type of violent harm receives a meaningful response, I was challenged to reflect on my understanding of accountability when the Me Too movement picked up momentum in 2017. Previously, I thought that if we could just advocate for higher conviction rates and incarceration, survivors would be more supported. However, my experiences in this work proved to me that what survivors really want is accountability, agency, and direct support. Restorative justice has provided some answers to that, where just reform of the system has not. In our culture and community, we're not really encouraged to think outside of carceral systems as a response to violent behavior, and it can be uncomfortable to do this. This presentation will ask you to be open-minded about what accountability and justice can mean outside of prison. There might be certain aspects of it that you feel are not adequate for combating sexual violence, and that's okay. This is ongoing and collaborative work with many possibilities, and this presentation is just a starting point. Our ask is that you remain engaged with the presentation through potential discomfort, including asking questions. And to keep in mind that justice means different things to different people, and that survivor well-being is at the forefront in our considerations. There will be an opportunity at the end to fill out a feedback form where you can give us additional input if you feel that we missed important pieces of the conversation. So, quick note on language and terminology. Throughout the presentation, we will take time with individual concepts and terms as they come up. But before we get into the meat of the presentation today, it's important to note some differences in language and terminology that pop up regarding the two main parties in any justice scenario. Specifically, we tend to use different terms in the advocacy world, in the criminal justice system, and in the restorative justice system to describe all of the participants. So first, a quick note on terms commonly used to refer to someone who has experienced sexual violence. Victim is typically used in the criminal legal setting and commonly used in our community at large. In the criminal legal system, the victim in a case is given certain rights under the Victims' Rights Act. Victims are considered witnesses to the state during prosecution, so it's not only a common descriptor, but it's also an important technical legal term. Survivor is the term that we tend to use in the advocacy world and what many people who have experienced sexual violence prefer. This word is meant to shift the focus away from terms like victim, which can imply helplessness or that something was done to someone. That can feel stigmatizing and like a loss of autonomy to some people. The term survivor helps to emphasize that someone is more than just their experience with sexual violence and has overcome the incident into safety. However, it is widely advocated that people should mirror the language that survivors give to themselves. While some prefer the term survivor, others feel that victim is a more accurate description of their experience. And then you might hear us also use the term person who experienced harm. This is generally used in restorative justice settings. It's meant to be a value neutral term and to highlight the reason for meeting and interacting with all parties because a harm has occurred. And then when we're talking about those who have committed sexual violence, there are three general terms that broadly fall into the same camps as those used to describe survivors. Offender is used in the criminal legal setting, especially after sentencing and in carceral settings. Describes the relationship between the person accused and the state. In the criminal legal system, people are prosecuted based off of offenses that they committed against the state rather than against a person or property. And let's hang on to that thought about who the offense is against as we move into more information about legal versus restorative justice settings coming up. Perpetrator is typically used in advocacy settings. It's meant to highlight the agency. It's meant to highlight the agency for the assault back with the person who perpetrated it to help avoid victim blaming. And then person who caused harm is the term used in restorative justice settings. It's meant to reduce bias and accurately describe the actions of the person while centering the harm that was caused to the survivor. Because of my role primarily as an advocate, I'll often default to survivor and perpetrator to describe these two parties. And we won't provide any personal value judgment on these terms. They all have their different uses in different settings. And any change in that usage throughout the presentation is more to reflect the setting that we're speaking of rather than endorsement over any one term over another.
So I think a foundation question is, what is justice? Justice is generally defined as the maintenance of what is right, with an emphasis on achieving societal fairness in outcomes. The definition of justice is answered and practiced differently between cultures, times in history, governments, and can be seen as the way a community accords with its values. In the US, our understanding of justice is often framed by what we understand to be the criminal justice system, which is a larger system that encompasses law enforcement, the court system, and correctional facilities or practices. These systems focus on inflicting punishment on those who have broken the laws and striving to balance the scales, most often in the form of punitive responses such as prison time, probation, or financial compensation. All of this is to say, the criminal justice system pursues people who break rules and punishes them to maintain safety through fear of that punishment. Priority for the criminal justice system, as we saw reflected in the language used, is on the impact people have on the state and not necessarily on each other. When looking at how the criminal justice system works, we can look at the questions that it tends to ask to understand how it attempts to accomplish its goals of maintaining that public safety. Questions like who committed an offense, what should be done to punish the offender, who needs to pay for what was done, and how does what happened align with state or federal law. The criminal justice system works by assuming that there is a standard for public safety that everyone agrees to and understands in a semi-homogeneous way. Additionally, criminal justice system's priority is to the rule of law and the impact that individual actions have on public safety, again, not on protecting individuals specifically. When a survivor chooses to pursue legal action through the criminal justice system, it's not them as an individual being heard. It becomes the state of Colorado, for example, prosecuting the person who did harm, and their agency is often removed in that process. So with kind of the understanding of justice and how the criminal justice system works, what is restorative justice? Restorative justice is a set of practices and broader philosophy that strives to repair harm within community through centering the choices and agency of those directly impacted. Central tenets of restorative justice include consent, accountability, safety, and again, agency for the person impacted. Restorative justice requires active consent from everyone involved, so there's no goal of forcing someone who's not interested in pursuing repair into it. It emphasizes accountability, where the perpetrator of harm takes ownership for what they did and is given clear guidance on explicit ways for repairing harm and learning new behaviors. Both of these practices depend on the person who was done harm being supported to safely express their wants and needs. Restorative justice does not require re-victimization or for the person who was harmed to push themselves through uncomfortable actions or situations, and should always be centered on safety and supported practices by facilitators. Questions that come up around restorative justice, or the questions that restorative justice tries to answer, are really strongly oriented towards the person who was harmed, their wants and needs, and how the perpetrator can repair them. Questions such as, what was the impact of the harm to the individual and community? What does the person who was impacted want for repair? What avenues are available for the person who did harm to take responsibility for their actions and offer this repair? And what is necessary for restoring trust and safety? This moves away from the idea that behaviors are best managed through punishment and shame, and instead toward the idea that behaviors can be changed best by building empathy and community. They challenge people who do harm to interrogate their own beliefs about their behavior and make serious changes driven by commitment to themselves and their growth, which is considered by participants in restorative justice programming to be a much, much more challenging ask. For example, someone who is sentenced to a year in prison for something they did just needs to get through that experience alive, where someone who is invited into restorative justice actions must engage in robust introspection and directly face the harm that they did when asking for forgiveness, which they aren't certain they'll get. Limitations for restorative justice for sexual assault survivors is the biggest one is it's very under-researched. All of the research that can be done depends on crime statistics as the baseline for the studies, with a less than 2% conviction rate for violent sexual crimes. Research into outcomes is bottlenecked by the criminal justice system's weak ability to tackle this issue. However, the research we do have shows that survivors report more positive outcomes and feel more agency in the process. Additionally, because sexual assault is an extremely high impact harm, it is often taboo to bring up non-punitive pathways for repair. It's not uncommon for people to feel like offenders are beyond help and need to repent or spend time in jail before they are safe to be around, despite evidence suggesting that punitive prison sentences are not the best pathway for rehabilitation. Restorative justice is often misunderstood by service providers, particularly in the criminal justice system, and are therefore not as seen as a potent tool for harm repair. We'd like to take a minute at this point to offer a point of reflection. This is a way to model restorative justice practices, so they are, again, entirely voluntary. If you would like to take this moment to reflect, you may, but if you do not want to, you do not have to. You can reflect. The invitation we are offering is reflect in a time that you had a conflict or experienced harm and felt heard by the person who hurt you. What feelings do you remember? Were there aspects of the conflict resolution that stood out to you as helpful? And if you'd like, you can write a couple of words down next to you on a pen and paper or in the chat if you feel comfortable sharing. Or again, you can just keep them for yourself to think about, whatever feels good. Thank you for everyone who participated and shared in whatever capacity that felt comfortable. Um, it's sometimes a nice opportunity to just take and reflect. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for people who put a couple thoughts in the chat as well. And I think we could probably spend a lot more time. I think if we were in a circle process, we could probably spend like an hour or more with everyone giving some thoughts, but we'll go ahead and move on back into the nitty-gritty. So if we want to understand how to maintain what is right after sexual harm has occurred, we need to know the impact of sexual violence on survivors. While every survivor is different and will respond to an assault differently, these are some of the impacts that we know many survivors experience based on all available evidence and my experience working with hundreds of survivors over the course of my time at the Blue Bench. One of the central and most traumatizing aspects of sexual assaults is the experience of losing bodily autonomy. By definition, a sexual assault is an act of violence that is done without consent. It is a perpetrator's refusal to respect a survivor's personhood and independence, which survivors experience as deeply dehumanizing. People experience assaults most commonly in places and among communities where they feel safe, so a lost sense of safety and feeling of betrayal from their community is very common among survivors. In the vast majority of cases, the perpetrator is known to the survivor. They are often a romantic partner, a close friend, or a family member. Experiencing an extreme and violent harm at the hands of someone from a trusted area of a person's life can feel really jarring. It can make a person doubt their judgment and feel isolated from people that they thought were safe. The impact of sexual assault on survivors are complex and comprehensive. Sense of autonomy, sense of safety, and can introduce mental health concerns such as PTSD. It impacts income, housing, and medical expenses. It really impacts everything about a person's life, which is why approaching repair and healing with the same comprehensive care is important. We're fortunate to benefit from the work of several important scholars who work with and study survivors and the impacts of sexual violence. In her work with survivors going back around 50 years, Judith Herman was among the first to recognize how severe the impact of sexual violence is on an individual. After many years as a therapist, advocate, and educator, trying to find ways to mitigate those impacts, she started asking survivors in her practice what they would need to make the situation right again. She published her findings in her 2023 book, Truth and Repair, and that will be on the resource guide sent out after the webinar and in the chat. Some of the things that she identified from her conversations as being especially important were public acknowledgement of the truth, the idea that communities believed the survivor, including bystanders and those close to both the survivor and the perpetrator. This also meant that they denounced the crime. A sincere apology came up as an important aspect, including recognition of why the harm done was wrong and the perpetrator taking accountability for their actions. Beyond that, they wanted personal healing for themselves, which takes resources like therapy, time, and support. Another important consideration was wanting the perpetrator to be rehabilitated, to understand what they did wrong, and to prevent the same harm from happening again to them or anyone else. And then we'll also talk a little bit about Kathleen Daly. She's a researcher in Australia who studies restorative responses to sexual violence and identified through research the following justice interests to survivors through asking a lot of the same questions as Judith Herman, what justice means to them, and what a satisfactory conclusion to their case would be. We'll notice a lot of overlap between these two. So participation includes being informed of the options and developments in a case and the ability to address the offense and victimization in meetings with the perpetrator and others. It also means that survivors are able to ask questions and receive information about what happened. Voice refers to an opportunity for survivors to tell their story. Validation is affirming that the victim is believed and not blamed for what happened. Vindication is recognizing that and a recognition that what was done to them was wrong. And offender accountability involves the community holding the perpetrator of the assault accountable through specific survivor-focused repair pathways. And as we've talked about several times, central to all of this is the ability for survivors to have autonomy in any justice proceedings. One of the most helpful and empowering things we can do for survivors after an assault is giving autonomy back to them in whatever way we can. So let's take a look at how the two justice systems we've discussed compare on these different important justice aspects for survivors. I compiled Judith Herman and Kathleen Daly's main points and then added another category for how each system allows for survivor autonomy. As a disclaimer, this is a visual that I made based off of my experience working with survivors and working with survivors in the criminal legal system and in restorative justice, and the limited research that's available on the topic. There are some limitations with this approach, including that less is known and observed about restorative justice, especially for myself, for survivors, because it's not practiced as often as the criminal justice system. Additionally, the nature of restorative justice is that it follows survivors' needs and is tailored to their experiences. So that makes it so that restorative justice is scored a little more on what's possible, whereas the criminal justice system is going to be subject to a little bit more scrutiny based on the reality of what we see from survivors navigating the system. So with that being said, we'll take a look at each of these aspects and explain why they were given the score that they were. I would love for in the future for there to be more data-driven representations of this, but this is kind of what I have with the information that I have. So to kind of explain the system of colors, red is to indicate that the system does not meet the aspect of justice that's listed there. Orange is that it doesn't meet that more often than it does. Yellow means that it meets the expectation more than it doesn't. And green means that it overall tends to meet that aspect of justice. So starting with participation. In the criminal justice system, there are systems in place that are supposed to give survivors the opportunity to be part of the process. The Victims' Rights Act includes the right to be treated fairly with dignity and respect, to be given regular updates about major stages in the cases, and to be heard by the investigation and prosecution before major decisions are made. Survivors are also allowed to give a victim impact statement addressing the court with how the offense impacted them and asking the judge to consider those impacts in sentencing, and they can testify during a trial, of course. While these are important gestures to participation opportunities, in practice, these things either don't happen or they're heavily restricted by the system. Time delays, not getting regular updates, and a lack of control over the direction of prosecution can all impact a survivor's ability to meaningfully participate in the administration of justice. For example, victim impact statements are subject to very specific court rules. They're not allowed to address the perpetrator directly. And when testifying, survivors are forced to answer questions, including ones that are often embarrassing and invasive from both the prosecution and defense. If they refuse to answer, they could be labeled an uncooperative witness and punished by the court. In restorative justice, the survivor guides how they want the restorative justice process to look and what they say, how they want to say it, and the setting they want to say it in. They're also allowed and encouraged to address the person who caused harm directly if they want to. When it comes to voice in the criminal justice system, survivors are given opportunities to tell their stories in a significant setting. For some people, having a law enforcement officer listen to their story is important, and being able to voice what happened in court can be empowering for survivors because it's a setting where they are perceiving meaningful public recognition and acknowledgement of the harm that they experienced. Unfortunately, because of the reality of the criminal justice system, survivors can experience discrimination, disbelief, and victim blaming that prevents them from coming forward to these systems at all. Once survivors do enter the system, there are all of those ways that we've discussed that they're restricted and discouraged from telling their story on their own terms. In restorative justice, an important aspect is helping survivors figure out how they want to tell their story and who they want to tell it to. Restrictions and limitations are not placed on how their story is told, and survivors can create a public setting that is significant to them since a courthouse might not be the ideal spot for every survivor. In terms of validation, in the criminal justice system, there's a heavy emphasis on finding out the truth. The goal is to answer those questions that we discussed before. What happened? Who is at fault? How should the person at fault be punished? In the process of finding out that truth, the victim is relegated to the role of a witness instead of centered as the person who was harmed. The system does not agree with the victim's versions of events unless very specific criteria are met. Survivors are often met with victim blaming, and the weight of accusation is not lifted off of their shoulders onto others. In fact, they're asked to bear that burden all the way through sentencing and jump through hoops to help the prosecution prove their version of events. In restorative justice, survivors are believed and allowed to participate without having to prove what happened to them. The goal of restorative justice is not a fact-finding mission, but an opportunity to support and give options to the person who was harmed, and an opportunity for the person who caused harm to take accountability, learn, and grow. And moving on to vindication. So we're flipping it a little bit from the pattern we have so far. This is an area where I think the criminal justice system is really capable of delivering meaningful results for survivors. Vindication, again, is this idea that the community is affirming for the survivor that the act was wrong, both morally and legally. When a conviction is achieved, survivors are told very explicitly that what happened to them was wrong in a legal sense. Oftentimes, the judge will also comment on the moral wrongness in addition to affirming that it was against the law. Through sentencing, there's also decisive action and sanction for the perpetrator that is not imposed in any other setting. As in many cases, the system's biggest strength can also be its biggest weakness. When the criminal justice system does not result in a conviction, which we know is often, it can communicate to survivors that what happened to them wasn't in fact illegal or wrong, and the system does not consider what happened to them harmful or wrong. In a system that only convicts about 2% of sexual assaults, the vast majority of cases of sexual harm are not offered vindication through the system. Because our court system is widely considered culturally to represent the standard of defining what is right and wrong through the law, not effectively prosecuting the majority of cases communicates to survivors and our entire community that sexual assault is not something that can be meaningfully addressed through normal justice mechanisms. This is one area of restorative justice where it's not set up to deliver as effectively. Because it exists largely outside of the legal system and does not impose any punitive measures on individuals who cause harm, it might not seem to take as strong of a stance in terms of affirming that the act was wrong, especially in the legal sense. There is absolutely an emphasis on the wrongness of the harm that occurred through an acknowledgement of the impact that it had on the person who experienced harm. However, because restorative justice is 100% voluntary, there's not a mechanism in place that can force an action that shows that what happened was wrong. And that moves us nicely into offender accountability. So, under the Fifth Amendment, the criminal justice system strives for innocent until proven guilty. This means that accountability is actively discouraged until the moment of conviction, and sometimes even after that, if the perpetrator wants to seek an appeal. Perpetrators are told very explicitly not to admit that what they have done and to stay quiet about all of their actions around the incident. This is done for important reasons to protect people's constitutional rights in the criminal justice system. The shadow side is that survivors completely lose out on an opportunity to see real accountability from the person who hurt them until a complete sentencing is attained. This can also be a real missed opportunity for the perpetrator, who can benefit from owning up to bad behavior. In the post-conviction stage of sex offender treatment, there are more opportunities for a perpetrator to take accountability and for the survivor to be involved in that process. The issue is that perpetrators only get to the stage if they're convicted, which we know happens in a small percentage of cases, if they're appropriately sentenced, if they successfully complete all other aspects of treatment and probation, and if the victim is informed about this stage of treatment and the opportunity to be involved. And in far too many cases, victims are not informed about this opportunity. Restorative justice requires that a perpetrator is accountable for their actions as a prerequisite to participation in the process. Before a perpetrator is allowed to enter a restorative process, they have to undergo a suitability assessment that is meant to determine if they're willing to take accountability for their actions. Survivors are then able to ask whatever questions are meaningful to them around accountability. Both sides will work with facilitators before coming together or communicating with each other to fine-tune what they'll say, with the explicit goal of addressing accountability in whatever way is most important for the person who was harmed. And we'll move on to healing. The criminal justice system provides few, if any, genuine opportunities for healing for the survivor, and oftentimes introduces new harm and trauma instead, and survivors are left on their own to deal with the mental, physical, and emotional aspects of being victimized. Many, many times, survivors have told us that going through the criminal justice process, especially having to testify and be cross-examined by the defense, was as traumatizing or more traumatizing than the assault itself. The system can provide some financial assistance that might aid in healing through crime victims' compensation or restitution. But that's pretty much it. Similar to the criminal justice system, restorative justice doesn't have the explicit goal of healing and therefore doesn't promise it as an outcome. Healing is often an internal process that is nuanced and multifaceted, and facilitators are trained to help survivors get connected to the resources for their healing journey. Some survivors report after going through a restorative justice process that and meeting with the perpetrator, having a meaningful dialogue with them, that's what they needed to feel like they can overcome what happened and move forward, but it's not guaranteed. And then we'll move on to prevention. So we know that prison time and other punitive measures do not tend to work as a deterrent for any crime, especially considering the low rates of conviction for sex offenses and the nature of most offenses. This is especially true for sexual violence. Additionally, prison populations are at a much higher risk for sexual violence and other kinds of trauma that don't tend to aid in teaching someone how their actions were wrong and how to not make the same decisions again once they're out. In reality, very few sex offenders are sentenced to prison time, even out of the extremely few that are sentenced at all. And especially in Colorado, the vast majority of sex offenders are sentenced to probation and community corrections. There are more systems in place through probation and sex offender treatment to try to aid in rehabilitation that are evidence-based and have a decent success rate. However, given the extremely small percentage of perpetrators that are reported and convicted, the criminal justice system is not providing prevention on a meaningful scale for our society. Ideally, the restorative justice process, through encouraging accountability and requiring perpetrators to understand why their actions are wrong, invests the time needed to keep a perpetrator from committing the same harm in the future. There's evidence of this success with other types of crime, but it's significantly less researched and a lot less data on how successful it is with sexual harm. And then we will talk a little bit about autonomy. As we've discussed through other aspects of justice interests, the criminal justice system leaves very few decisions up to survivors. In my work, I often have to remind survivors that they're not being investigated and that they're not the ones on trial because of the scrutiny that they have to endure throughout the entire process. While there are a few good faith efforts to give survivors input and include them, at the end of the day, they're a witness to the crime against the state and not the focus of the harm being addressed. Restorative justice is centered around survivor autonomy and being a 100% voluntary process. It makes no decisions without the full consent and participation of the survivor.
Cool. So what does restorative justice look like in practice in these kinds of settings? Because the process is survivor-centered and focused on the harm that was caused and what can be done to make it right again, survivors can ask for almost anything to be included in the process and for it to be conducted in whatever way is most safe, comfortable, and effective for them based on their justice based on just what they want and need. Some examples of things that survivors ask for are for the perpetrator to attend therapy, for the perpetrator to read books or articles and come to the conversation prepared to discuss what they learned and how it affected their understanding of what they did and its impact. Survivors can and are encouraged to bring people close to them as a support. They can also bring items, music, poetry, or anything else that is meaningful to them to be integrated into the process. The only thing that a survivor cannot ask for through restorative justice is for punitive measures or retribution against their perpetrator, like prison time or physical or psychological harm. Ahead, we're going to look at different models that are commonly used in restorative justice. The first is, I think, often the most common, which is circle process. And this is a meeting or dialogue that happens between a harmed party and the person who has caused harm. It typically happens with all the involved parties sitting in a circle to symbolize an even playing field, and that all voices heard throughout the process are equally important. To avoid crosstalk back and forths, and to give each person speaking plenty of time to formulate and verbalize their thoughts, facilitators will introduce a talking piece so that only the person who's holding the talking piece can speak at a time. This helps organize the flow of the conversation and gives everyone, again, an equal opportunity to contribute. Facilitators will often start everyone off with an invitation, some sort of question or prompt, and then allow each member of the circle to answer or respond. The facilitators plan in advance with all parties what will be addressed through pre-conferencing. The goal of these pre-conferences is to understand the parties' goals and what they want to get out of the process, as well as to workshop the questions and specific things that each party wants to bring up. This can also be a good time to coordinate resources and supports that ensure the dialogue goes smoothly and safely. Separate circle process, which is in cases where a face-to-face dialogue isn't appropriate, possible, or doesn't feel safe for the harmed party. One or both sides might participate in a circle with community members to process feelings and work on solutions to healing and moving forward. This could be beneficial if the survivor is more interested in addressing their community and how they responded to the violence, rather than meeting with the perpetrator. It can also be a good tool if only one of the parties is willing to engage in restorative justice. An example of a separate circle process is surrogate. So surrogate restorative justice processes are used most often in cases with sexual harm and can be implemented when one party is not willing to participate in restorative justice, or if bringing, again, the parties together isn't safe. In surrogate process, a survivor from one case is brought together with a perpetrator from another case. This can be beneficial for both sides to hear the other's perspective and stories, to then apply their specific cases and to gain a broader understanding of the impact of this type of harm, the perpetrator, and the rehabilitation and learning that is possible for perpetrators for the survivor. Another example is shuttle dialogue, which can happen when a survivor and perpetrator cannot or do not want to participate in a conversation face-to-face. In this instance, facilitators will speak to both parties and ferry concerns and information from one side to the other. This can also help slow down conversation and give each side a meaningful opportunity to be heard and respond. This can happen through letters, through facilitator summary, through email, things like that. Yes, we can see this example of the shuttle dialogue. So, of course, safety considerations are at the top of our mind and central for the ability for both sides to participate effectively and get something meaningful out of this process. Some important safety considerations are once again that the survivor gets to dictate each step. They can ask for and expect any safety measures to be implemented. Survivors are best equipped to assess their risk and safety, so the most important thing we can do is give this decision back to them. Additionally, dialogue between perpetrators and survivors is always supervised, and facilitators can intervene if a dialogue is getting off track in a way that could impact safety. A restorative justice process will not begin in the first place, again, if the perpetrator has not been pre-assessed to have a level of stabilization and no ongoing harm, either with the survivor or anyone else. As part of that process, there is likely a focus on learning and growth from the perpetrator that ideally ensures there will not be any future offenses. Survivors are also entitled to advocacy and resources during a restorative justice process to help safety plan and implement those plans during the process. So, can criminal justice and restorative justice happen together? Ultimately, yes and no. This diagram is a visual way to view the relationship between punitive and restorative solutions to harm. High accountability but low support is punitive. High support and high accountability is what we would consider restorative. Survivors do not forfeit the opportunity to restorative practices because they have reported and the case has gone to the legal system in any capacity. As we discussed before, survivors have rights through the Victim Rights Act that allow them to have input in their case, and they can ask for restorative justice to be included in that process. This adds support to the accountability, helping move the resolution more towards the restoration than just simple punitive action. This could look like including restorative justice as part of a plea bargain or integrating it into sentencing. Restorative justice facilitators can work with both parties prior to sentencing to help give information to the judge, prosecution, and defense to tailor a sentence to the needs of the survivor. However, because of the lack of autonomy that survivors have in criminal justice systems, it's just not guaranteed that they'll be able to get everything they want and need in these systems. The DA has final decision-making power, and many DAs, kind of like we discussed, do not believe that restorative justice is appropriate for sexual violence. The criminal justice system and restorative justice are at odds in a number of ways that could also make it difficult to do both at once. Some restorative justice facilitators will not work with the criminal justice system in any capacity because restorative justice is meant to be 100% voluntary as a foundational concept. So being sentenced to restorative justice and forced by the court to complete a process is seen as antithetical to the true nature of the practice. Many facilitators will still work on these cases, given a solid suitability assessment as a form of harm reduction and to meet the needs of the person who experienced harm. But it is a place where these two systems have a little bit of a disconnect.
So moving a little bit more into how the Blue Bench works with all of these systems. One of the ways that we help bridge the gap for survivors who might want to engage in some type of restorative practices is post-conviction advocacy. This is available for survivors whose perpetrator has already been sentenced. This could be entirely its own presentation, and it has been, so I'll keep it fairly brief, but I'm happy to answer any additional questions if we have time at the end. And I'm also mindful of time and seeing that we're getting a little bit close. So, one of the main areas that survivors can be involved in the criminal justice system is a process called clarification. This stage comes at the end of sex offender treatment after perpetrators have been involved in an individual and group therapy, completed curriculum on a number of topics, including healthy sexuality, consent, victim impact, and other relevant topics. They begin the process of clarification at that point, which is focused on their own personal accountability to the person that they harmed. An aspect of that therapeutic approach is to write a letter called a clarification letter to their victim, taking responsibility, acknowledging that what they did was wrong, and outlining what they've learned through treatment and probation so that they won't do the same thing in the future. Survivors can choose whether or not to receive those letters. Some people do want to know what the perpetrator says, and some don't. Both are totally okay. Case managers help to communicate with the treatment team to edit those letters and make sure they address aspects of the offense that are important to the survivor so that it can hopefully be truly helpful to both the perpetrator and the survivor. Clarification work can also include ongoing communication between the survivor and perpetrator if that's what's wanted. Case managers then work with treatment and probation to help make that process safe and ensure that communication is facilitated in a trauma-informed and victim-centered manner. This communication can look really similar to many of the restorative justice communication techniques that we've already discussed. We lean heavily on restorative practices and principles in these conversations to ensure that all of those safety needs and survivor justice interests are met. So again, this is a system that can look a lot like restorative justice, and the Blue Bench helps to advocate for survivors and for their rights to get access to it. So the goal of restorative justice is to ask what a survivor needs and then follow through on making those things happen to the best of our ability. This is what helps survivors rebuild their trust in community and individual safety and mitigate the impacts that we explored at the beginning of this presentation. Many times, survivors do not want anything to do with the person who harmed them, and what is best for their ability to heal and move forward is to never have contact with that person again. In those cases, we don't have to say that there wasn't justice just because someone doesn't want to pursue traditional justice avenues. Many of the survivor justice interests that we discussed earlier do not have to involve the perpetrator or the legal system at all, and are more about making sure that the survivor feels supported and doesn't have to continue to carry the weight of their victimization. A survivor might not need to face their perpetrator in any setting or interact with them at all. They just need the support of a community and the resources to move forward after being assaulted. And that's justice too. If you're asking what a survivor needs and following through to help make that happen, you're doing justice work.
So yeah, we want to reiterate this goal to share information on the differences between these systems, and to highlight that the Blue Bench is here to provide services that meet the needs of survivors, including some of their justice interests, such as therapy to aid in healing, advocacy, and help with expenses and other factors that can impact a survivor's life unfairly after an assault. We help ensure participation in justice proceedings as well as opportunities to voice their experience. We believe every survivor who comes to us and validates their thoughts and feelings about their experience. We also provide primary prevention programming. We support survivor autonomy by empowering survivors with information and resources to make the best decisions possible for them. Restorative justice practices deeply inform our work at the Blue Bench, and we're really honored to get to share this fascinating pathway for survivors and potentially perpetrators.
If anyone has any questions at this point, I would like to leave some space for them to be able to put them into those Q&A boxes, that Q&A box. And if you have any questions later on that come up, please feel free to reach out to us. You can always reach us at communityed@thebluebench.org. I want to thank Haley and Maddie so much for all of their hard work and this amazing information that they have shared with us. And I want to just highlight a couple of upcoming events and trainings that we do have at the Blue Bench. We are offering free youth empowerment and safety, which is our child sex abuse prevention program. We have some virtual trainings on February 11th and March 18th, and then an in-person training on the 7th of February at the Belmore Library. These links here, if you grab these links, you'll be able to register for those free events. And you can also register on our website. And would like everyone to join us for our upcoming webinar. Please look for details on this webinar, which will be in Spanish and is focused on the impact of sexual violence in the Latinx community. Please watch out for more information about that exciting webinar. And also, if you do not already, please follow the Blue Bench on social media. We post educational tips, community resources, upcoming events throughout the week. And you can also sign up for our newsletter for quick organizational updates and news. And remember to look out for that resource guide following our email and the webinar. I know some people are having trouble accessing it through the chat. We'll definitely send that out to you. And finally, we really would love your opinion. Please, if you're able to grab this QR code to share your thoughts through our quick survey. It really helps us improve our programming. It helps us be accountable to people who fund our programs, and it helps us know what people want to hear more about in webinars and education programs. And then if you are able, please consider donating to the Blue Bench to support our community education programs. The more we can expand our prevention efforts, the safer the community becomes for everyone. So thank you again for everyone for coming today. I do see that we have a couple of questions, or we have at least a question here in the Q&A. So I am going to leave it back to Maddie and Haley to answer these questions, and feel free to stick around for a few more minutes if you do have any more questions about restorative justice or Blue Bench services or any of our community education programs.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. I think that's such a good question. Their question is can we advocate for restorative justice accessibility in the Denver community? Maddie, if you have an idea, my initial thought is by modeling restorative justice practices, like demonstrating and practicing the emphasis on who has been impacted and what do they need, and helping remind people in positions of power to focus on those questions. I think that can help. And like as the modeling continues, like community input builds, I think that helps. You have a different idea, Maddie, too.
No, I think that's great. Definitely a big part of it. And then if I had to add anything, I'd say just uh like talking about it and making sure there's awareness out there. I think we've found with people coming to us and getting connected with case management, that when people know about restorative justice, they ask for it. And then we can help try and make that happen. There's also some good statewide organizations, and I hope that I remembered to include those in our resource guide, but I will name them really quick. So there's the State Coalition, Colorado Coalition for Restorative Justice Practices. And then there is the Restorative Justice Colorado. I pulled them up, so I'll try and put the links in the chat in just a second. But those are great organizations that are trying to do advocacy for making sure that restorative justice is integrated into a lot more practices and places in the state. Um, and then to kind of answer that second question, how would a survivor who is asked to be a witness for the state request RJ as an alternative? It's hard to say. I think because every situation looks a little bit different. Usually, if a survivor is participating in the criminal justice system and their case is in the court system, they're hearing from the DA, the DA's office, from the victim advocate from there. And hopefully also they're connected with us, and we're part of that process and that communication. So there's usually we're seeing cases in stay in court systems for a year or more. And during that time, they're going back and forth, making different decisions, like presenting different evidence and just all of the legal stuff. And so there's usually time in between there where the DA is going to want to meet with the survivor and get their input. Like we said, they don't have to do anything that survivor asks for, but those opportunities are there. And especially if they have a victim advocate, either somebody who's really willing to listen to them in the DA's office, or if they're connected with us, that's something we can then help set up a meeting for or get that communication started. So
Yeah, and I think that my sort of almost quippy response is don't do it alone. Like if a survivor wants to pursue this other process, get that person connected with us, get that person connected with other resources in Denver so that they're not having to advocate alone, because it's really hard. So I think, yeah, that there are people who are in our systems doing this work, including us, that want to be doing it, and so I think just like add our voices to theirs.
Thank you so much again, Haley and Maddie and Hema. Really appreciate all of your expertise and knowledge and hard work. And I hope that we'll see participants at our next webinar and back in the community.